Eddie Van Halen has died. He was a famous singer and co-founder of Van Halen. Known as the King of Six Strings, he started a new era for the guitar and was the quiet storm behind rock's biggest hits. Eddie Van Halen lived a life that not many people really understood, though. Behind the bright lights and loud crowds, his fame didn't keep him safe. It let him down. On stage, he looked like a happy genius, but offstage, he fought monsters that no guitar could drown out. It's not just about rock music. Betrayed trust, broken bodies, and a history that can't be talked about now. Why did the band that changed rock music for good break up? Also, why is it that Eddie's whole story has never been told? Because of one simple request, and what it doesn't say might say the most. The roots of genius. Eddie Van Halen's family history goes back to Nijmegen, Netherlands. He was born into a musically talented and culturally large family. He had a Dutch father named Jan Van Halen who played jazz music and an Indonesian mother named Eugenia. Because the Van Halen family had a mixed background, they were the target of racism in Europe after World War II. Eddie had experienced the quiet but painful sting of racism even as a child. He often had to deal with mean looks and slurs that made him feel like a foreigner in his own country. The family moved to the United States in 1962, even though they didn't have much money and didn't speak English very well. They did this because they wanted a better life. They made Pasadena, California their home. Life as new refugees, on the other hand, brought new problems. Eddie and his bigger brother Alex were picked on a lot at school, especially since Eddie and Alex didn't speak English and were Asian. Cultural acceptance wasn't the rule back when the civil rights movement was just getting started. People often made fun of the Van Halen brothers' accents, clothes, and general looks, causing them to feel deeply alone while they were growing up. During this time, though, music slowly became both his safe place and his personality. His father was a classically trained clarinetist and saxophonist, and he made sure that his kids learned a lot of music from him. Eddie and Alex both signed up for classical piano classes when they were young kids. Even though they couldn't read the music at first, their teachers were surprised by how well they could play by ear. The problem wasn't that this field was unique, just the point of survival through the boys' lives in this world that mostly turned them down gave them a sense of purpose and power. Eddie's early life was marked by being moved around and being treated unfairly. All of these things would feed his spirit of rebellion in his songs. He later became famous for shredding electric guitar solos and changing the sound of rock. But it was these early struggles with national identity and finding comfort in sound that gave him the drive to express himself through music that he would never lose. As a mixed-race refugee in a new country, Eddie Van Halen had to deal with a lot of problems. These problems gave him a thick skin, but they were also the sparks that he would use in every note he played. Still, Eddie found comfort in playing the piano, but a sudden turn of events at home would change his life and rock music forever. The Guitar God, by accident. Eddie Van Halen's path to becoming a well-known guitarist started with piano keys instead of 6 strings. Eddie and his brother Alex took classical piano classes as kids from their jazz musician father Jan, who thought it was important for them to have a strong background in music theory. Eddie got very good very quickly. He won a few local piano contests even though he couldn't read sheet music. The only thing he used was his ears, which would later become his signature sound. Even though Eddie knew a lot about classical music, he felt limited by the stiffness of the style and secretly longed for the freedom to create instead of copy. It all changed when the boys switched instruments. At first, Eddie played the drums while Alex learned how to play the guitar. But Eddie soon saw Alex stealing time on the drum set and playing better than him. Because Eddie was interested, he picked up Alex's guitar and never put it down. The spark that started one of rock's most famous careers was this lucky switch. Eddie became completely obsessed with the instrument almost overnight. He spent countless hours by himself in his room, practicing and pushing the limits. He would lay down with the guitar on his chest and fall asleep. When he woke up, he would continue playing, a single-minded commitment that pointed the way to his future inventions. This drill that went on and on wasn't just about learning chords and scales. This was trying to make a sound that hadn't been made yet. Had also found the Beatles by that time. Eddie felt something from the melodies, an excitement that classical music could never do. Eddie became interested in rock and roll after hearing the Fab Four. Trying out different tones and patterns, Eddie stopped reading the book and started to play around with bending strings, flipping switches, and changing hardware to make his electric voice sound more unique and expressive. While traditional training had its own rules, playing the guitar gave him the freedom to break them. Eddie wasn't just learning to play the guitar when he was a kid. He was beginning to be a pioneer. He didn't want to be like his heroes. In fact, he wanted to be bigger than them. What started out as a typical fight between brothers over the guitar turned into the start of a style that would change rock guitar forever. Eddie's rise from classically trained pianist to guitar god by accident has less to do with ability and more to do with his never-ending desire to learn, hard work, and a natural desire to go the path less taken. Van Halen's rise. Eddie and Alex Van Halen were hungry young artists in Pasadena in the early 1970s. They played backyard parties under the name Mammoth. The band was rough and loud, and they were looking for a singer who could match the Van Halen brothers' furious music. David Lee Roth was that voice. A flashy neighborhood singer who got in the door because he had access to a powerful. Roth was a great performer, even though his singing range wasn't very wide. The final lineup was completed by bassist Michael Anthony, who brought strong musical skills and tight rhythms to the group. Soon after, Roth suggested that the band change its name to Van Halen. Van Halen quickly made their mark on Los Angeles' Sunset Strip, becoming known for their electrifying live shows, because they thought it sounded more iconic and marketable. When they mixed hard rock, blues, and Eddie's out-of-this-world guitar skills, they made a sound that was both new and instantly appealing. Warner Brothers Records saw how often the band played shows and offered them a record deal. In 1978, they released their self-titled debut album. With songs like Runnin' with the Devil and Eddie's groundbreaking solo in Eruption, the record was a huge hit with both fans and critics, quickly putting Van Halen at the top of the rock world. But even though the band seemed to be doing well, there were already some problems going on. Eddie Van Halen was a bit of a stickler, and he cared a lot about staying true to the band's music. Roth, on the other hand, was more of a natural actor and showman who didn't care about stage tricks, publicity, or making money. The friction was made worse by the fact that the people involved had different personalities and artistic goals. Roth's flashiness made Van Halen a hit at MTV concerts. For Eddie, though, the music started to get less important as the showmanship and ego took over. Van Halen got better and better, and Eddie and Roth grew farther apart. Eddie wanted to change the band's sound by adding synths and a new shape, but Roth stuck to the idea that the band was just a bunch of wild rockers. But their differences as artists went beyond just how they looked. They showed two very different ideas about where the band should go in the future. Even though this strain often led to amazing music, it also sowed the seeds of instability that would one day threaten to destroy everything they had worked so hard to achieve. It was the start of a story about success that turned into a burning time bomb of competing goals. Architect of Sonic, Eddie Van Halen changed the way people played the guitar, not just played it. His most famous invention was the two-handed tapping technique, which let him play fast-paced stringed notes that no one else thought was possible on a guitar. Eddie didn't actually come up with tapping, but he made it popular in rock music and made it his own way. The method became very popular very quickly. When Van Halen's first record came out in 1978, the solo on the instrumental track, Eruption, which lasted just under 2 minutes, shocked both listeners and musicians and changed what they thought a guitar could do. Eddie was creative in more ways than just how he played the guitar, though. It went all the way to how he built it. He built his own hybrid guitar, which became famous as the Frankenstrat, because he didn't like how limited off-the-shelf instruments were. Eddie put together a guitar with the powerful humbuckers of a Gibson and the tremolo system of a Fender Stratocaster. He routed out the body himself and used masking tape and a quarter as hardware. He was able to make a one-of-a-kind instrument that fit his style and gave him the tone and freedom he was looking for. He set a new bar for customization that many guitarists and luthiers have followed. Eddie mainly changed the tone of what a guitar was as a tool for personal expression, which was the opposite of what most people thought about its mechanics and methods. He didn't think of it as a tool at all, but as a live part of himself, an experimental way to express himself through soundscapes. And pushing the limits of music, Eddie tried to feel what it was like to be both an engineer and an artist with the instrument by making the whammy bar sound just right and the harmonic feedback just right. His solos were more than just displays of skill. They were talks or even outbursts of emotion that went beyond language and genre. Eddie's new ideas went far beyond hard rock. He had an impact on metal, pop, punk, and even jazz. Players from all of these styles tried to copy his skills, and others were just inspired by how often he tried new things. Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, and even younger guitarists like Tom Morello and John Mayer have all said that Eddie was a big impact on them. His combination of technical brilliance and artistic fearlessness changed the way people play the guitar for generations. Eddie Van Halen did more than just master the guitar, he made it into something new. What it cost to be famous young. A shockingly young age was when Eddie Van Halen's fight with addiction began. His father gave him booze when he was only 12 years old because he thought it would help him calm down before public speaking. This wasn't a fight or a time of peer pressure, it was behavior that was shown by a parent who had the same performance worry. What started out as a bad way to deal with stress turned into a lifelong battle. Eddie lived in a world where drug use was not only accepted, but even pushed as a way to deal with the stress of ability and expectation. As Eddie became more famous, he became more and more dependent on drink and then drugs. Constant traveling, creative demands, and personal problems within the band made him want to get away even more. During most of Van Halen's peak, his musical talent stayed the same, but those close to him started to notice troubling trends, including mood swings, strange behavior, and feeling alone. Eddie's friends and coworkers often said that he was two people. One was a humble genius, and the other was someone who couldn't be recognized when he was drunk. His relationships were hurt by his addictions. Band reunions didn't work out, his marriage was hard, and he had times when he wasn't close to the people he loved the most. Eddie's mind and body were scarred from his drug use. Years of drinking too much and smoking a lot had led to a number of major illnesses, including tongue cancer in 2000. Eddie thought that keeping guitar picks, which are often made of metal, in his mouth caused his cancer, but the doctors told him that smoking was actually the main cause. Eddie had surgery to remove a third of his tongue, but he later had other problems, such as a vascular necrosis of the hip, which is common in people who drink too much. There was no doubt that these were not isolated health concerns. They were signs of a way of life that was getting out of hand. Even though Eddie's problems were getting worse, he would still have a long and unpredictable road to recovery. He was sober and drunk at different times for years. He often gave in to his old habits again after being told they were killing him. By the early 2000s, everyone could see that people were addicted to drugs. It looked like he was weak, messy, and mentally lost. Fans used to worship him as a guitar god, and now they were seeing their hero give up and die. It was now very clear what the price of early success was. Eddie was famous all over the world because of his skills, but they also put him in a cycle of stress and self-destruction that he would fight for the rest of his life. But while Eddie was fighting his own demons, the real problems were happening behind the scenes, in the band that carried his name, betrayals, and the end of bands. It wasn't just music that caused Van Halen to fall apart, it was also about ego and power. In terms of hurt, the way experienced bassist Michael Anthony was treated was one of the worst. Anthony was a founding member of the band and helped create their signature sound and harmonies, but over time he was pushed out of the band's inner group. People were shocked when Eddie's son Wolfgang Van Halen took over on bass when he turned 18. What made things even worse was that Anthony was forced to sign away his rights to songwriting credits and future earnings. This made him nothing more than a paid worker in the business he helped build. The breakup was the start of a darker time in the band's history, when they were less motivated by a shared interest and more by their own goals. Michael Anthony wasn't the only one who got into fights over musical direction and credit. Eddie Van Halen had a lot of problems with both David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar, because they didn't agree on music and had personal problems. Roth and Eddie kept arguing about what the band was called. Roth wanted to put on a show and sing cover songs, but Eddie wanted to explore his creativity more deeply. At first, it was easier to work together with Hagar, but arguments over who was in charge, tours, and best hits albums caused Hagar to leave the band twice. Both singers made important contributions to the band's history, but neither relationship could handle the volatile mix of pride, ability, and control that propelled Van Halen to fame so quickly. These kinds of conflicts were not just in art. They were also very personal, and in some cases went on for decades without being solved. As of 2025, Sammy Hagar has said in public that he hasn't talked to Alex Van Halen, the drummer, in more than 21 years. Hagar says that the tension probably comes from the fact that Alex can't work because of a spinal injury and can't handle the fact that the other members of the band are still playing without him. As the difference between Alex and Eddie, Roth, or himself, he stressed that he wasn't a guitarist or a singer, but a drummer. He also stressed that Alex didn't have creative power. Eddie and Hagar made up before Eddie died, but things with Alex are still very raw because band members' relationships, or lack thereof, are still shaped by their own pain and pride. At some point, Van Halen would be remembered more for what might have been than for their reunion shows. What was supposed to be a happy music event turned into a minefield of lawsuits, anger, and broken loyalty. There was a lot of public conflict, decades of quiet, and rivalries within the band. The things Hagar said in 2025 make it clear that the wounds are still fresh. Even though it's been hard, the band's music will live on through concerts and tribute projects. Time did more than just spoil Van Halen, but didn't trust each other, had problems that hadn't been fixed, and had the egos of men who used to work magic together, cancer and falling apart. Around the end of the 1990s, Eddie Van Halen's body started to show the damage done by years of drug abuse, stress, and the constant demands of his work. He had been ignoring the increasing pain in his hip for years so that it wouldn't get in the way of his musical work. He didn't know it, but the real problem was an arterial necrosis, a disease where bones die because they don't get enough blood. It is often linked to drinking too much. In 1999, Eddie finally had surgery to replace his hip because the pain was too much to bear. The surgery was a physical reset, but it was also a turning point in his life. A forced admission that his body could no longer handle the pain. Eddie was hit by a much worse health problem, just as he was starting to feel better after surgery. In 2000, he went to the dentist for a regular checkup, and the doctor noticed something strange on his tongue. Biopsies proved that it was cancer. Eddie mostly kept his illness a secret, going to Houston for treatments like surgery and chemotherapy. A big chunk of his tongue had to be cut off, but by 2002, he said he was cancer-free. Even though Eddie won, what he thought about what caused his illness showed how deeply he was conflicted. He said it wasn't smoking, but the metal picks he held in his mouth while playing. This excuse let him keep smoking and put off making important changes to his life. Even worse, the damage from drug abuse and bad health habits kept building up over the years. Eddie had health scares on and off after the treatment. This was his next journey after beating cancer. He smoked for a long time, and pictures and interviews sometimes showed it. He didn't want to know how much the habit cost him. In the middle of his pain again, the cancer came back and spread to his lungs. In the 2010s, his health got a lot worse. He had a couple of very bad illnesses, including strokes, and being told that his lung cancer was in its last stage. Due to years of drinking and drug use, his immune system was already very weak, and the events that followed were too much for it to handle. At the start of 2020, when the world was shut down because of the COVID-19 pandemic, Eddie quickly got worse. Being alone in the US got worse because he couldn't go to Germany to keep getting care because the borders were closed. He would end up in the hospital with pneumonia, have several strokes, and need a certain amount of air to breathe by the fall of that year. Ed died on October 6, 2020, when he was 65 years old. His son Wolfgang, his brother Alex, his wife Janie, and even his ex-wife Valerie Bertinelli were all around him. A life with very highs and very lows ended in tragedy, and it was a sobering warning that even the most talented people would have to pay such heavy prices. Redemption through being a dad. Eddie Van Halen didn't get better because of fame or praise. It was because of something much more personal, being a dad. In 2006, his son Wolfgang replaced longtime member Michael Anthony as bassist in Van Halen. This was more than just a change in the band's lineup. Eddie felt like he was born again emotionally. Giving his preteen son the stage with him brought him back to the main reasons he started playing music in the first place: love, creativity, and connection. Eddie felt like he had a purpose again when Wolfgang came into the picture. He changed his focus from calming down on his own problems to restoring trust and security in his family and band. Eddie's addiction once again threatened to stop his progress during a tour in the late 2000s.